Welcome, everybody, after the short break, but also welcome everybody whose social feed we have just interrupted because this is a panel that is streamed to our social media as well. So anybody on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, or any other social media, this is a part of a bigger event happening on Hopin. So just for the future, make sure to check us out and not miss out on the entire Disruption Forum. So the name of this panel is Open Innovation, how to leverage the ecosystem of APIs, platforms, and fintechs, or rather the innovation trap. And we will be joined today by people from companies like Citi Ventures, Alloy, and BNP Paribas Polska. But I will allow the moderator to give a better introduction. And this time I move into the shadows because we have a proper journalist joining us to moderate the panel. Welcome, Isabel. I'll leave it all to you.
I'll take proper journalist as my new bio. Hello, yes, I'm Isabel Woodford. I am a fintech reporter at Sifted, which was spun out of the Financial Times about 2 years ago. And we cover startups and I guess the intersection with incumbents like big banks. I'm joined today by a fantastic panel who hopefully will join me now on screen to introduce themselves.
Absolutely. So without further ado, I will introduce the guests and outroduce myself. So in order of Paulina from BNP Paribas, Savitri from Citi Ventures, Charley from Alloy, take it away.
Brilliant. So nice to be joined by you guys. I think this is just the perfect panel to dive into this question of the innovation trap. So if I could ask each of you to give a tiny summary of who you are and what you do, 20 seconds, this can be your elevator pitch. Paulina, we'll start with you.
Wow, 20-second pitch. So I'm a Chief Innovation Officer at BNP Paribas Polska and co-author of, let's say, a quite interesting implementation process, which led us to 16 implementation and 1 investment in less than 2 years. So for now, we've got new strategy and looking for startup, especially touching open banking, platformization, and sustainability to work with us. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, a call out there for fintechs to come and join BNP Paribas. Brilliant. And Savitri, please.
Yeah.
Sure, thanks. Hi, I'm Savitri Bishnath. I'm currently an entrepreneur in residence, or EIR, as affectionately known, at Citi Ventures. I'm part of the D10X team where we build products and services internally for the firm. Previous experience in about 18 years in banking, financial services, startups, and strategy.
Brilliant. And you're speaking on your own behalf today?
Yes, thank you. So I'll be speaking, from the views are all my own and not on behalf of Citi Ventures.
Brilliant. Thank you for clarifying. And finally, who's Charley?
Hello, my name is Charley. I'm the GM of Fintech of a company called Alloy here in New York. We're a fintech infrastructure provider that helps banks and fintech companies make better decisions through our API and our dashboard to help manage KYC, AML, fraud, etc. So I manage our fintech segment, but I've also worked very, very closely with our banking segment. Prior to Alloy, was head of growth at a company called Ramp here in New York in the corporate card space, also a fintech startup. And part of that, did a bunch of stuff at a company called Plaid, also in the fintech infrastructure space.
Plaid almost needs no introduction at this point.
Yeah.
So let's dive in. So I think this panel's fitting today, actually, because Barclays, the UK bank, confirmed a story that I did in February that it was pulling Ping It, which was its decade-old payments innovation product. And it was just a reminder that, you know, when innovation is done in-house, sometimes it can work and sometimes it can take a long time, but there can be a decay there. And it raises this question of how do banks do innovation, and is there a fundamental culture clash, perhaps, when it comes with integrating with fintech? You know, these are 300-year-old bureaucracies sometimes. So how do we merge that with the fast, you know, funky, savvy fintech cultures that we're seeing? Paulina, can you answer that question? Is there a culture clash when we see banks and fintechs working together?
Yes, I'm glad to answer that. Yes, this is a culture clash, especially when you're after 8 murders and you've got 100, let's say, years of history here in Poland. So this is quite let's say, a challenge. But to do the innovation to work effectively with the fintechs, you need to onboard, let's say, people with a different mindset, a kind of rebels that will do, let's say, the job differently, that will question, why do we do this like that? Do we need those rules? that will ask questions fundamentally and change the processes inside, because you need to change inside. You need to change processes, because without that, you will go nowhere. So you need to have, let's say, a team who could be a kind of middleman between the fintechs, between the startups and, let's say, typical bankers, to start working together effectively. Without that, you will be nowhere.
We have seen some examples of these middle teams. RBS, for example, have an innovation hub, but they're still ultimately, you know, when you think about who pays your wages and who's responsible for your job, it is still the big bank. So to what extent can you separate from that bureaucracy? How much leverage or independence do you need to give that middleman?
Well, we are quite independent, but what we needed to do was to show, especially to the middle offices like procurement, legal, IT, security, that you make their life easier. So this is basically what's behind our success. We joined forces with those teams. We produced a process, really, really simple process to onboard startups inside our company. So no tender, no paperwork, just talking about the solution, testing the solution, and then trying to onboard that solutions to the bank. But I'm sure that because of our job, especially the daily life of our colleagues from procurement, compliance is a lot more easier. And for sure, we are not trying to onboard a startup for 2 or 3 years like we used to do, but we are doing that in around 6 months. So this is quite huge, and this is easier than it used to be.
Yeah, it's fun. I guess 6 months as a goalpost is an interesting feat. Some fintechs might say 6 months is a long sales cycle. But Savitri, I wanted to come to you. Savitri, you've been, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 8 years or so at Goldman before your current position. So you've also been inside banks before joining Citi. Can you talk about this? Perhaps, I don't know if you would put it in your own words, but this inherent tension that you might see between a bank like Goldman and even now Citi innovating, and how that's been done in a constructive way in your mind?
Sure. I think, yes, can use the word tension, but I think that there's a natural and probably in some ways for the marketplace, a healthy tension between banks and fintechs, given, banks long established in most cases, having been around, if we think about the incumbents, and then fintechs, looking at opportunity spaces. But I think, outside of that, there are also a lot of opportunities. So to your point about, what you've seen worked well, there's opportunities to collaborate and cooperate. And I think in those cases, sometimes the parts are, in some are, greater together than as they are individual. So, one of the things that I've observed is that a lot of the fintechs also have a lot of people, even their founders, but they tend to also hire a lot of bankers and people with deep financial services experience. And I think that can be really helpful. But in terms of what I think can be successful and what I've seen, I think there's, particularly on the fintech side, patience. I was talking about kind of getting a multi-year process of onboarding down to 6 months, right? And that being, pretty darn good. And I would echo that, in terms of that time frame. There's a lot that goes on behind that complexity. It's not only just dragging of feet and politics. There's a lot of robust controls, different teams. Unfortunately, there's a lot of silos in banking, but they're there usually for good measure and have come about after so many years. In Citi's case, hundreds of years, right, of being in business and understanding what the balance is between, commerciality and sort of risk and control, right? And I think that's a strength on the bank's part and really necessary. And one of the things that, banks, we could argue this point, but they bring to the table is both brand recognition and trust, because they are so heavily regulated. With the fintechs, on the other hand, they really give banks this opportunity to extend their services, and actually sometimes can really beef up the ability to focus on the core and digitization in that area where it's our expertise within a bank, but using partners and fintechs as in particular to think about innovation, to think about the other areas that you're not able to get to with your core teams, and kind of as an extension, I think is an important sort of viewpoint. And that's probably where I've seen banks have the most success working with fintechs and taking that point of view.
Yeah, so you mentioned their politics, which I think is just a fascinating question when we think about, or we remind ourselves that banks are just a collection of human beings with sometimes opposing incentives. But you mentioned politics, and I'm interested to just on the partnership side, which partnerships has Citi found to be the main focus when it looks to externalize its fintech capacity in particular, and where have you seen that politics? What can you just give us a little bit more detail about what that looks like and how perhaps it's been overcome, if at all?
Sure. Okay. I hope I didn't set myself up too much with the word politics, but I think, you have to kind of find, I think the way I think about it is, there are so many different sort of jobs and roles and lenses that people in banks take to things. So, we kind of use a broad sweep of regulation, but you've got risk managers, you've got control folks, you've got compliance, you've got legal, you've got tax. You've got so many different areas where people are going to bring a very particular viewpoint into what it is that you're doing when you're rolling out a new product or service. And I think for us, like I said, I sit in a team within Citi Ventures that we build new products and services. And so, very classic, you're going to think about what I build myself versus who I can partner with and bring in. And I think, what we're looking to do is kind of sometimes think about, okay, what's the, the advantage to just building everything ourselves, which in some banks, recollection back to Goldman was sort of the way everything is built in-house.
Yeah.
But that, at what cost, what time, and by the time you get it out to market, is it something that is still viable versus sometimes fintechs that are so super specialized, they've put their heart and soul into building this one thing, often, for the benefit of banks, all right, as the end customer. And so, when we're looking at them and what kind of partnerships work well, I think are those who are who have the patience, as I mentioned earlier, can ask the right questions, and can kind of stay the course. And I know it's really hard. Time is money for fintechs in a very different and real way than it might be for us in banking. As we kind of take multiple years to launch things. But getting into that partnership, staying there, figuring out where you can add value, pivoting even within the relationship you have with that bank is probably going to really can sometimes I'd say probably be really beneficial to the partnership in general and to that fintech, as opposed to kind of saying, well, these guys are just slow, they're taking too long, let's move on to the next and see if we do better there, because you're likely just to kind of be starting from scratch in that scenario. So
yeah, interesting. Okay, I want to bring in Charley now as the fintech representative.
Yeah.
Charley, have you demonstrated, or your company Alloy demonstrated that patience that we've heard, and what's the fintech perspective on these 6 months, 1 year cycles, and how do you find that, and how do you do that constructively?
Yeah, I would say it depends. It depends upon where you are as a company, right? Like I don't like to offer blanket advice, but generally when I do talk to early stage founders, and hey, I have this great idea and I want to sell into bank and fintech, sell into a bank or a strategic FI. The first thing that I'll warn is yes, it will take time. There's a high degree of patience to get not even a deal done, but even from a deal done to getting through vendor onboarding, through compliance, to rollout, through training, through change management, through actually getting into production and actually seeing value driven from the product. It's a multi-year, I think, deployment that you need to start to think about, right? Even just getting the deal done and getting onboarded takes time, right? And for good reason, I think, right? Like banks, it's funny. I think I've talked to a bunch of founders, and it's crazy. Our product, we know it works for them. It's going to solve a bunch of problems. I used to work at JP Morgan before I went to Plaid, and I remember I would talk to a lot of fintech companies, and the feedback I get was yes, but as everyone mentioned, we're hundreds of years old in terms of our brand. We have inherent trust with our customers. No offense, but I don't even know you're going to be around in a year, right? That is the inherent sort of risk that you have with these fintech companies, which is both good and bad, right? I think fintech companies, one of the value add that we often provide is kind of approaching from a lot of problem sets from more first principles view, right? Where we don't have the legacy tech debt. We don't have, this is just the way things have been done and the way things should be done. We can approach that mindset and try to bring the right partners along on the banking side. But I think it very much depends upon the stage of company. If you're 100% depending upon that bank to make or break your company, that there's a lot of hope and belief around that. Whereas at Alloy, for example, we have sold, and we work with a lot of actually a very, very large portion of our revenue comes from banks, right? And they're fantastic partners for us. It takes longer than a fast-moving fintech company will, but there's like very good reasons for that. And I think understanding both sides is really important.
Yeah, I do think perhaps this idea of fintechs moving fast and breaking things is now going to be fundamentally rewritten, because it's just doesn't seem to be possible anymore, or at least not with B2B fintechs. You mentioned there about working with banks yourself. Can you just explain, you don't need to name drop if any are particularly difficult, but can you give an example of where this idea of the client's always right, or you have to adjust to the banks, where that has gone too far and you just have to say, we have to scrap this as a partnership?
Yeah,
happened?
It's a good question. That is something that I think a danger mode that you always want to escape from as like a fintech company, if you are building a B2B product or there's a partnership opportunity, is making sure that the problem set that you're solving is broadly applicable across your client base. So I think it's just when you think about company construction, right? I think one thing that I keep top of mind when I'm thinking about what product to be built and is what's kind of truly scalable across the prospects and client sets that I have versus what's something that's custom, right? And I've seen a lot of companies gone down, the custom route a little bit too much, where instead of looking like a truly scalable platform, you start to look like and start to be treated like a dev shop, or an easy way of like, oh, hey, can you build this thing? I don't have budget on my tech resourcing right now, but you have great engineers. If you build this thing, will you sign this contract? We'll sign the contract. And I can see that kind of, I've seen instances where that's gone wrong. And so I think one, continue to make sure that you have that like the right alignment with the right senior stakeholders that are kind of making that decision. And then two, being really, really clear and transparent to yourself on what are the things that are within scope that you as a company are willing to build. What are things that are not within scope? And I think also, at some point, if it just starts going the wrong way, making sure that you're comfortable, leveling set, and confident in the value that you're providing to that bank.
And very quickly, do you think it's important to have an individual within the bank that spearheads the partnership?
Yes, I think it's critical. Yeah, I think you need it across the stack, right? You need it top down, having a sponsor, an advocate that's kind of helping you navigate through that bank and navigate and understand what are the driving principles, what are the priorities, what the roadmap is going. And I also think it's also important to go bottoms up, right? And actually getting buy-in from the actual people that are going to be using your platform, your software. And that entire motion is super important. That takes time.
Brilliant. Paulina, I want to come to you next because I'm interested in this idea of building trust between banks and fintechs. As I've said, there may be an inherent distrust or an inherent tension. And we've seen, for example, Commonwealth Bank in Australia now release its own buy now, pay later product, having already invested in Klarna, which obviously has done the same. So have you encountered, let's call it, distrust from fintechs? Is that something that you have to manage within your job? And do you have a way or a short formula of how to overcome that?
So we do a lot on education the market. So whenever we build something, we educate. We tell a lot how to work with us, not to waste time, not to surprise anybody. So I'd say that working in fintechs, it's easier than building, let's say, the value of the potential partnership inside the bank. Yes, because the most important thing is to find a sponsor, to find somebody inside the company who will sit with you on the table and say, okay, I see value in here. Yeah, I believe we can build value together. And honestly, I believe that, let's say, our startups, they just got used to, they know that 6 months for us, this is quick for them. No, they know, for example, that if you go MVP or you're just pre-MVP stage, don't talk to us. You won't survive. Yeah, this is not the stage to talk to the bank. Especially. So I'm just saying that openly. Yes, you have to have that in mind. And I also ask, when fintechs approach me, I say, hey guys, what value we could build together? Because honestly, sometimes they just say to us, hey guys, just buy our technology. I say, why? Yes, I don't want your technology without you, without your head, without your knowledge. I'm interested in building value together. I will take my colleagues who have a brilliant banking knowledge on the stuff. You take your team and let's build something together. Grab each other hands. I send to the market, to the target customers, that we've got something nice for you. And of course, this should be scalable thing. Yeah, it should not be a one-time small shot, because this is a waste of time. So what we do when a company, when a startup just comes to our door, we say, okay, so what we can do with your technology? We look deeply at our priorities, what we need to do, especially in the times of COVID, when the, let's say, challenges are full, and the, let's say, time frame is shorter, so we need to react to really quick. But it also means that we need to be wise. We need to just pick those companies, those startups that can, let's say, help us and our customers in those crazy times, and pick those, let's say, solutions, those technologies that can be scalable, not only inside the bank, but also inside the group, because BNP Paribas, this is not only a bank. So this is an opportunity to have a scale, and this is what we do.
Yes, so scalability. But just to push on that question, have you lost a deal, for example, with a potential external fintech because of distrust, because perhaps of fear that there'll be copycats? This is a classic business.
No.
Never happened.
No, because we are sometimes we are even brutally honest.
Yeah.
While talking to a startup, so let's say they know what's happening and what can happen, if let's say a process will take long, or we do not see any value. So let's say we've got the kind of code of cooperation. So let's say the rules of the game are known. So we did not fail because of lack of the trust.
Okay, interesting. Savitri, I want to come to you next. When people think about banks and fintechs, often I think they think that relationship is driven out of the bank seeing a threat, let's say. So when you at Citi Ventures make an investment, what drives the investment rationale? Is it this company that we're investing in could one day be a threat to us? Or is it this company could be a massive add-on to us, and therefore we will invest and then reap the benefits of, even as a client?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And you would see, obviously, I think any bank in any industry is going to be wise to keep abreast of what's happening in the market and kind of project forward, right? And think about different scenarios and plan for that. So you'd have to think that any, from CEO down, if you're doing your job right, you're thinking about those things. But if you even just look up Citi Ventures, right, you'll see, very kind of clear around what the investment thesis is, right? Where the team is looking for startups on the cutting edge, right? And those are the ones that are going to have the potential to really augment and enhance what, Citi's products and services today. And ultimately, the aim is to help our clients, in the world that they're operating in, right? So that goes both from a consumer perspective and an institutional or B2B perspective as well. And so it's much more about innovation around extending capabilities, bringing new things in-house, and accelerating the pace that we can do that, than it is to kind of, sort of keep your enemies close, your friends close and your enemies closer type of thing. It's much more around, can we bring them in here and actually see a difference in our own business for having, had that investment.
And again, on that trust question, how do fintechs perceive Citi Ventures as a investment partner? I mentioned to you before that Santander Ventures rebranded so that Santander was no longer in its name, even though they are still the only LP in the rebrand, which is now called Maro Capital. And the idea was that fintechs didn't want a big bank venture fund on its cap table. How do Citi Ventures experience that?
Right. So, again, I'll just say I'm caveat that I'm not an investor, at Citi Ventures. So, probably some slightly different experience, but I am interested in what's going on in the market. So in my experience in talking to fintechs and in my team, we do, partner with them and talk to them quite frequently. It's less about, I think, okay, I'll just say it this way. And it's probably a self-selecting group, but they're always eager to work with us. So, typically, when we're speaking to them, they understand the benefit that working with a large bank is going to bring. And so, they're, putting best efforts into from a sales process to really show value and, what it is that we're going to benefit from working with them, and typically a lot of flexibility. To Paulina's point about things need to be scalable. They want to learn the bank and they want to learn other areas. If it's not just specific to one project, maybe that we're working on, that they may be able to add value. So I see it from a place of it's actually not from mistrust, but if anything, it's sort of they have a deep belief. They started their business on we can really help banks be better. That's our area within this ecosystem, and so it's more just about us getting our mind, thinking the same, right, and figuring that this is the right place, time to partner. Versus, people kind of any of the fintechs kind of saying, well, I don't really know if I could sort of, share this with you and open the kimono. I think we experienced that quite a lot less than maybe you might imagine. Yeah.
Interesting. And Charley, just to come back to you on this idea of trust as a fintech and the way that you perceive banks, can you give us an idea of the general, I don't know, again, if you could name names, brilliant, but the banks that you see that are most forward thinking and most embracing of companies like Alloy and further down the line or behind Plaid, are there names of banks that just are forward thinking? Is it geography? Asia, I think, is often tipped as banks now looking to innovate at these core structures. Just an idea now of who are we looking at leading this?
It's a good question. I don't know if I have any specific names that pop out, but I do think that I think, at least to me, like the banks that are sort of the most innovative or the ones that are most forward driving are those that actually do truly kind of embrace like innovation as part of the core team, right? I think that one thing that I warn, I think, founders and teams against is like innovation theater. And I think we see that sometimes across some FIs of, oh, we're going to, do road shows and maybe we'll invest in some companies and this is like our innovation effort, right? But nothing actually ever gets done in terms of an actual partnership or actually getting embedded into the core underlying product, right? I think innovation teams are often a great way because they have a lot of connectivity into banks, but at the end of the day, like where the money really is for a lot of these fintech companies are in the core underlying business and actually getting integrated and having a partnership with the core business. And so I think the banks that tend to be the most forward thinking are those that have been able to bring in the right talent, bring in the right people, and have a pretty big kind of shift in terms of how they view innovation and disruption within their own business units.
From the outside, are there any traits or structures that you see and you think this looks like a bank which is going to do serious innovation?
Yeah. I do think that there is a signal and commitment on just who you're working with. I think goes a long way, right? If you're working with, and I think it usually really kind of susses out when you actually kind of go into conversations, and like the mindset of that bank is really, I think, where it goes down to how it actually works out. Where if you're going into a bank conversation, you're constantly kind of being challenged on. I get an example. So back in the day. We were trying to convince a lot of these FIs that open banking and the way of accessing data via credentials and OAuth or whatnot, like this is where the world is moving towards. You have mobile coming in and people don't want to be uploading, interacting with their bank in a very archaic manner. They would want to use something like Plaid. It's much more seamless. The vast majority, every time we went to a bank, pretty much every bank came back and said to us, I don't believe you. Like no one wants to do this. No one wants it. We don't think that this makes sense. And we think what we have right now is sufficient, and we don't believe that like you're a higher converting experience, right? And so we actually pivoted and said, okay, great, we're going to focus solely on fintech companies because they're sort of seeing this market and seeing the trends happen in the space, and we're able to prove out, okay, great, like we're able to get companies like Robinhood, like Chime, like all these fintech companies in the US to get to massive user volumes because they're built on top of Plaid. And I think with that was able to bring a lot of these banks to the table of like, oh no, yeah, they're getting like massive scale and they're empowered by companies like Plaid, and we should actually kind of reapproach how we think about the customer experience and what customers are demanding from us from more first principles view. And so I think that like my general bias tends to be if they are starting to bring in more external people within the bank, or the people within the bank there is a very big driving function as to why they need to change or why they're thinking about the change. Tends to be a high correlation there. Like I mean, right now, every single bank in the world, I think, is very innovative. We've had this global pandemic. Right now, right? Like I think there's a lot of conversations that we've had at Alloy where, a year ago, I was like, oh, okay, this is great. Digital online only account onboarding, right? Versus in-branch onboarding. It's on a roadmap for 2025, right? Turns out as of today, it's immediately on the roadmap right now. We need to figure this out. So there's other things that I think that the important thing is figuring out what is driving that change and where it's coming from. Is it coming from market trends, forces, an exec team mandate, budget, and then kind of aligning it and seeing, is there actually team alignment up against that?
Yeah, another thing that I do think is interesting, and maybe Charlie, this for you before I open it up, is you mentioned about how a lot of fintechs have former bank people in them, you yourself. But what I don't think we see is the reverse, where we have head of innovations who have been leading people at fintechs. And I wonder if that, I don't know if there's exceptions to that who you know of, but I wonder if that's a problem, that the sort of synergy only works one way.
It's interesting. I think we are starting to see. I have actually quite a few friends that have now gone on back from a fintech company back to banks. I do think the operating style is very different, right? Like I think like the motives around, like when I was at JP Morgan, right? Like the way that I was sort of taught to think was more around protecting a revenue base. Like we have a customer base that we have existing trust in, we have revenue numbers and targets we want to hit. We care a lot about retention and we care about growth, but it's predictable, right? On the fintech side, I think the way the operating model is, like we have no customers. We were trying to do everything we possibly can to just survive, right? And get to product market fit and grow really, really quickly. And so the motivations and incentives and the operating cadence and model is very different. I think we are starting to see more banks. You can never fully adopt, I think, that like startup methodology, right? I think your motivations and incentives are just completely different. Which is why I think it's funny when I see banks, we're doing startup within a bank, and I'm like, at the end of the day, if your startup fails, you're not out of a job, right? You still have a salary, and so your incentives are inherently always different, even personally, and that causes different behaviors. But I think we are starting to see kind of cross-pollination both ways, and starting to see that, which I'm excited about.
Interesting. Paulina, I wanted to come to you and just ask sort of the broader question. You feel free to piggyback off the back of that question, but the broader question, if there's one or two lessons that you've taken from your role as Chief Innovation Officer, like what are your number one tips to perhaps other people in that role or to other people who see your role and how to do that properly?
How to do that properly? Build alliances. Don't fight with people, I'd say. Yes, because you need to have, let's say, a long bench of people working with you to have a success. Yeah, so sometimes I'm just thinking that part of my role is just playing chess effectively, yes, to onboard people, to help them feel that we can bring value together. And the success, the implementation will be their success, will be on their, let's say, backs, on the heads. This won't be my success. So I'd say build alliances. Don't wait that somebody will come to you and say, hey guys, from the innovation, now you've got, let's say, the space to work. It won't be that easy. So build alliances and just show to the guys that do the business that you are the pragmatist team. Yeah, that you will help them to build the value, that you're not crazy, that you're pragmatic and you know and understand the business. I'd say that this is the most important part of the job.
Alliances. And Savitri, I wanted to come to you. Similar question. I know you're in EIR now. Perhaps you have a reflection there on how to link fintechs and banks well. And the second part of that question is also, in your mind, do fintechs seriously compete with banks? And is that a primary, let's say, motivator for this idea of innovation?
Sure. So I think, within, as an EIR, in that role and like how we think about innovation, it's an interesting one because maybe to Charlie's point, you're seeing basically a bank say, okay, there is something there to an outside-in perspective, right? Let's bring in people who think differently than the rest of the bank does, and potentially, can help coach, guide, and bring different ways of thinking in. So that is, that's sort of a core part of us being there. But at the same token, you have to kind of then be realistic about the banking environment that you're operating in, and what you're going to be able to get done. So, maybe to the point that we're hammering home a lot, if you kind of come in day one and go, well, this isn't working like a startup, it's not moving as fast, it's not doing all the things I did when I was a part of a fintech, you're kind of going to be defeated from day one. But it's about kind of finding, again, alliances, and understanding, like, really kind of just getting that product market fit internally right? So who's going to be the right sponsors? Where does this thing move the needle? How do I prove that out? And so I think actually a lot of your entrepreneurial skills kind of come in play even internally as you're trying to position what it is that we're trying to do within this large bank that can also, kind of be seen as many smaller companies really kind of operating together in terms of how diverse what banks do, is. And so, I think that's a part of the recipe of success, is to be able to almost use it as a transferable skill, as I was agile and I worked really quickly and I broke I moved fast and broke things in my my fintech. Let me go do that in a bank. It's not going to work, right? But there's probably some key threads and ways of doing things and ways of thinking about things that I think are successful. And I'm sorry, remind me the second question.
I asked if you thought that just fundamentally, are some fintechs a threat to banks, in the idea of, maybe in the retail space or beyond? How seriously do you view the threat of fintechs broadly to banks?
Yeah, I think yes, there are definitely a category of fintechs in their ambition, in their design, that are a threat to banks in terms of them wanting to become, the next generation of banks, right? And kind of take a larger and larger share of the pie. So particularly on that retail side, you're right. You can see the neobanks, as we might, call them, or challenger banks, coming up, and because they don't have the legacy systems, they're not regulated in every market in the same way. They also don't probably, in some cases, have that large geographical footprint that also makes banks so complex, and multiple business lines. Things are. Those can be a threat because you can grow quite quickly, quite big, quite quickly. And there's a lot of funding dollars out there for the right fintechs as well to enable them to compete. But at the same token, I think just as I was thinking about, prepping in this conversation, I think there's probably a lot more fintechs that aren't a threat and probably fall into that partner category. And I think, banks, I think banks, to the point of like bringing innovation in-house, you probably need to kind of differentiate the two and understand, if you're seeing someone who you really think is a threat, what is the threat, and what it is that is our comparative advantage that we can exploit to kind of counter that. And I would just kind of look at the numbers. We've been saying that banks are under threat for well over a decade. I think Bill Gates' first quote went back to 1994 about banks are going to be gone. But yet you see banks over the last several years growing stronger and stronger, and seeing some of their best seeing growth and seeing some real profitability, right? So at the same token, I think there's as much as there's a threat, it's also supercharging a lot of banks and kind of putting it front of mind that you have to do things differently, and just basically informing strategy.
Yeah, just before I ask you your last question, Charlie, just very quickly to you on that question of, do you see fundamentally fintech or pillars of fintech as a serious threat to banks, or do you just view it as everyone will coexist, and this is probably a marginal motivator for banks in terms of seeing that threat? What do you think?
I would say it depends. It depends upon. I think whenever it's funny. Whenever I talk to different bank execs, depending upon revenue line that they own, I think they have a very different perspective on competition versus cooperation amongst fintech companies. But I think the thing that I kind of go back to, I think even 5-10 years ago, I think that it was a bit of a ridiculous statement to go into a boardroom and say these fintech companies are directly competing with our customers in terms of time, in terms of mind share, in terms of brand. And I think that that's kind of gone now, right? I think now there is acknowledgement, I think universally amongst financial institutions, that we do need to have a fintech strategy, whether it's compete, whether it's partner, whether it's invest, buy, etc. And I think that's been, to me, the biggest market shift, where 5-10 years ago wasn't really, I think it was on some sort of strategy team's radars, I think, right? And maybe a few slides and something the shareholder, the letter that you put in, and now it's boardroom strategy.
Yeah, and we're definitely seeing banks' narratives change. We have Jamie Dimon now saying things like fintechs are a serious threat, etc. So definitely in the last few years, I've seen that shift slightly, that acknowledgement.
Yeah. And I think we have seen, fundamental shifts in some revenue streams, right? If you look at, I was like looking into the brokerage space recently, and I think Robinhood, for all the pluses and minuses, like has caused a fundamental shift in how you think about a brokerage business. Yeah. And it has caused everyone in that business to change the revenue model, which has never happened before in a long time.
Definitely. Okay, so last question before we wrap up then, guys. I wanted to ask, I generally ask this question, but if you could, let's say, wave your magic wand and implement one change in the ecosystem that would allow you to do your job better, or that would allow, let's say, the bank or the bank partnership to perform better, what would be the one thing that you would change? That could be perspective or a feature or composition of teams, etc. I know it's a big question, but I'm curious if there's one bugbear to the jobs that you do in facilitating innovation. Paulina, if I can come to you first.
Yes, I'd say let's break the silos. Yes, we are one bank to the customers, so the customer does not really care if he or she is talking to the retail banking or personal finance or the SME part. We are one bank, yes. So the channels that we use to cooperate with the customers are ours, not for one business line and drive by one business line. So let's try to do it. I'm seeing the green lights according to that part, but I'd say that this is the most important thing. We need to feel inside these kind of companies that we are working together, that this is our own one company, one front line to the customers. Let's break the silos.
Right, brilliant. Silos. Okay, and Savitri, same to you.
Sure. What directly comes to mind is I spent several years of my career working out in Singapore. And I think what the ecosystem there really benefits from is, really close connectivity with the regulators and that sort of regulatory sandbox idea that I think is awesome. And so you're kind of, as long as you're playing small and you're testing and you're learning, you have a lot of room to play and to experiment. And I think when you're thinking about innovation and doing something really different, and in financial services, we're so important to what we do, in our day-to-day lives, just from a individual to community to country perspective, finding opportunities in bigger markets, and I'm based in the US now, to provide that kind of space and breathing room to try new things and do things a bit differently. And access to kind of be able to kind of talk to your regulators, or whether it's the IRS or another part that you might be concerned about, I think would actually, if I could wave the magic wand, I think that could make things a lot easier.
Interesting. And last but not least, Charlie.
I think mine's very tactical. If I could wave a magic wand, I think more innovation and vendor onboarding would be greatly appreciated. I think the number of times, it's getting better, but the number of times I have to fill out a 100-page Excel doc that's asking, where are your servers located, and are you on-prem? And I'm like, no, we're on AWS, and it's a cloud infrastructure, and here's all the questions that are not applicable to my business. And then spending the next month explaining why this is, I think could speed up some interesting cycles.
Brilliant. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me. For people who've been watching, we at Sifted have a fintech newsletter. If you just Google Sifted fintech newsletter, or we have a corporate innovation newsletter, say Sifted corporate innovation. You guys will continue the conversation there. Thank you so much for joining me.
All right. Thanks, Isabel.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Thank you so
Bye.
much. I think we'll be taking over very soon.
Absolutely. That we will. So thank you, everybody, for this wonderful panel. Isabel, thank you for giving us a school into proper journalism, not my pen pusher hack level journalism. I see you're smiling. So just to wrap up, I'm pretty sure that everybody enjoyed it. We've been enjoying a very healthy and steady amount of viewership. With those events, usually we have a situation where you have peak and then you're going down, whilst we have been enjoying a very healthy and constant amount of viewership. So we're pleased to announce to all of the speakers that you have been listened to diligently by the audience, and thank you, dear audience, for being so patient with us over those couple hours. So perhaps a good way of wrapping this up would be mentioning the quote that we heard at the beginning of Weathering the Storm, that this is not the same boat we are in. We are in the same storm, however. So hopefully all of those ideas, innovative solutions, and concepts that you've heard today will help you weather the storm if you are a fintech or just preparing to be one. So as a last part, I would like to invite everybody to join the booths and the networking session, because that will be going on for around 30 minutes. And otherwise than that, see you on the next Disruption Forum. See you on the next Disruption Talks, which happens every Tuesday. And hopefully see you in the section where you download our Disruption Forum FinTech Guide. Thank you so much for attending. Bye-bye.